Right, okay, so I think most people are in now. So I'm going to make a start. As you may be aware, well, some of you definitely are because you're coming back again. This is one of a series of webinars on different career skills, on how we can teach our students or develop our students' career skills. And this week we're looking at decision-making skills. So how we can help our students to get better at making decisions in the classroom, outside the classroom, and of course in their future lives and careers. My name is Rachael Roberts. I'm a teacher trainer and materials writer, and I'm one of the author team on Pearson's new upper secondary course, High Note. So I'll be showing you some examples from that course throughout the webinar, as well as from other places. I'm also a qualified life coach, working particularly with teachers and other people working in education. So this kind of area, decision-making skills, career skills, is something where I can kind of wear both my hats, if you like. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and the link to the recording and your certificates will be sent out to everybody who is here within 2 weeks after the event. So if you don't get it immediately, don't worry, it will be coming out to you 2 weeks at the latest. Right, so decision making. I've got a question for you to start with. So a piece of research was done fairly recently into how many decisions the average teacher makes during the day. So first task for you, see if you're awake. How many decisions do you think a teacher makes during their working day? Just guess a figure. Let's see who gets close. Okay, Nabila says 20,000, 1,500, 80, 400, a lot, 20, 100, hundreds, a million. All right, okay, there's a lot of wild guessing going on here, I think. Yeah, a couple of people have actually got that right. Okay, so according to this piece of research, this was how many decisions the teacher makes. It was 1,500. Now, you know, obviously that's just an average and just one piece of research, but what it tells us is just how many decisions you as teachers are making every day. And, you know, for example, let's look at some of the decisions that you might be making. So you might be thinking about when a student makes a mistake, are you going to correct it immediately or later? You might be thinking up the right question to ask a particular student or the class in order to promote learning. You might be thinking, well, should I change the pace of the lesson now? Or which student should I nominate to answer this question? So as well as all the decisions that you have made before you even stepped into the classroom, when you were planning and deciding what you were going to teach, you are also making constant decisions while you're in the classroom. And you can only really do that as effectively as you do because of everything that you know and because of your experience. And that's why when you first start teaching, it can be very difficult because you have to make all of these decisions and you don't necessarily have the experience upon which to base your decisions. And this is, of course, true for students. Students also have to make lots of decisions and they don't necessarily have the information or the experience to make good decisions. So, you know, what kind of decisions can students have to make? Give me a few examples. So what kind of decisions do students make in the classroom, outside the classroom, in their lives? Give me a few examples. Okay, whether to volunteer or not. Do you mean volunteer and answer or to work as a volunteer? It's both, actually. Go to class or skip it. give an answer. Yeah, I mean, they may know the answer, but still have to make a decision about whether they're going to risk saying it, put up their hand or not, do their homework, sleep or pay attention. Don't make mistakes. Well, that might not be a decision because they might not be intentionally making a mistake, but whether they take a risk of making a mistake. Which session to attend, what to wear, yes. Write in pen or pencil, a classic, says Diana. So yeah, so maybe they spend too much time thinking about some decisions. So students too have to make lots of decisions, but they are likely to find that harder perhaps than we do, and we need to be able to support them. Now, one of the reasons that students are going to find making decisions a bit harder is because of everything that is happening in their brain. Now, it used to be thought that the brain was pretty much sort of set and fully grown and developed by the time that we got to like 16 or 17. However, we now know that this is absolutely not the case at all. And in fact, the brain continues to develop very rapidly right up until sort of our late 20s, maybe even 30. And the brain goes through a process beginning in adolescence and finishing in the late 20s. Yeah, so 25, Bogomila says, yeah, it can be later as well, believe it or not, up to 30. So when we're talking about the teenage brain, we're not really just talking about teenagers, but let's focus first of all on teenagers. So this process starts at adolescence, and the brain is made up of lots and lots of connections between neurons, which we can refer to as neural pathways. And the more you do something, the stronger and more lasting that connection becomes. And when you're an adolescent, there is a process going on which is known as neural pruning, which is basically lots of those connections are being taken away to make room for new growth and for new connections. So all of this is going on. At the same time, we've got hormones, of course, flooding around the body because this is adolescence. And all of this leads to teenagers really functioning in quite a different way from adults. So we know that as a result of this, teenagers are not as good at making considered decisions, for example. So just thinking about the brain, so if you imagine that this here is like my neck stem, so this bit here, right deep inside the brain, there is a little part, in fact it's kind of two little parts, but I've only got one thumb, called the amygdala. And then on top of that, folded over, as you can see in the picture, right, we have the frontal cortex, which is this part of the brain. So this part of the brain, the frontal cortex, is a much more sophisticated part of the brain, and it really develops during adolescence and 20s. This part of the brain, the amygdala, is a much more basic part of the brain, more primitive, if you like. And this is the part of the brain that we use when we're in danger. So this is where we get like the fight-flight response from. So essentially, teenagers are acting far more from the amygdala than they are from the frontal cortex, because this hasn't finished developing and the connections between the two are not fully there yet either. So therefore, when they make decisions, they tend to be very instinctive kinds of decisions without too much thought, more emotional, more reactive. And that's why teenagers are more likely to act on impulse. They might misinterpret like social cues. They can be a bit paranoid at times. They're more likely to get into accidents or fights or engage in dangerous behaviour because of everything that's happening in their brain. So this doesn't mean, obviously, that all teenagers, are completely wild and unable to act in any kind of logical way. However, it does mean that they are likely to find this kind of thing like decision making and logical thinking more challenging, if you like. And so we need, I think, as teachers to be aware of this and to be ready to support them so that they can start to develop that part of the brain as effectively as possible, and to develop those connections between the amygdala and the frontal cortex. Yes, as I've just noticed, there are some sound problems. If some people can hear me, yeah, okay, so if you can't, you're reading the message, so I will just carry on. Okay, so we need to help students because they're at a stage where they are really sort of learning to use their brain differently and developing different parts of their brain. So one way that I think that we can do this is by gradually helping them to take more responsibility for their learning. So gradually giving them more autonomy and responsibility. In many ways, I think there is a parallel with being a parent. You know, our job as parents, if we're parents, is to gradually get our children to a place where they don't actually need us anymore. And I think it's the same in terms of our students. You know, when they're this age, we are trying to help them get to a place where they don't need us anymore, where they can act autonomously. But there are some challenges in giving students more autonomy, as I'm sure you're aware, right? What kind of challenges can you think of that students of this age might have with having more autonomy? Can you just put it in the chat box? And apologies if you heard any noise there. That was my 17-year-old coming home from school and clearly having a challenge in reading the notice on the door that said, "Don't come in." Okay, so lack of motivation, being afraid of public appearances, fear, confidence. Yes, I'd agree with all of those. Bullying. Yes, I'm not. Oh, I see what you mean. I think if they kind of take more responsibility and are more visible, if you like, that somebody else might pick on them. I think that might be what you mean. Okay, well, these are some of the things that I came up with as possible problems. Okay, so there is a tendency often for teenagers to avoid the more difficult choices. And people have mentioned fear, and I think that is part of it. There's, you know, part of always using the amygdala more is that we are likely to respond in a more fearful kind of way. So it might feel safer to avoid those more difficult choices. It could also be laziness, because they haven't really understood why it's important for them to take this responsibility. Which brings me to the second point, right? So they may have a limited understanding of what they do actually want or need. They don't have the perspective that perhaps we have as their teachers of what they're going to need in the future, right? So they're very focused on now. Third one, yeah, they may be unwilling to take responsibility. So this, again, it could be down to fear, it could be down to it just being a bit too difficult. But they, you know, you might try to give them responsibility and they kind of want to give it back to you. And then all of these things, you know, sometimes they can lead to potentially some chaos in the classroom. You know, if you hand over autonomy to students and you give up your control, what's going to happen? Right. So a couple of people here have mentioned like clear objectives. All right. So I think that's very important. So here are some suggestions, some solutions, if you like, to these problems. And this is based on classroom management techniques by Jim Scrivener. So the first thing to say is that you don't obviously have to hand over all control immediately, or indeed ever, but you can start really, really small. All right, don't worry about being late. That's fine. You'll catch up. A couple of people just come in. So you can start by offering really small choices, just simply asking them things like, you know, shall I write that on the board? You can make rather than making choices too open, you can make them binary. So rather than saying, how long would you like to do this task, where you might find you get 25 different answers, you can ask them, well, would you like 5 minutes or would you like 10 minutes? So that's a much easier to make a choice. You can allow divided outcomes. So you can have one group doing choice A and another group can choose choice B. They don't all have to choose the same thing. Then the middle point here, be clear about what is not negotiable. So not everything has to be negotiable. That's absolutely fine. You are still the teacher. All right. So it's being clear about what can they choose and what are you actually going to choose for them. Bogomila says, I always give them only 2 choices. Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, but maybe we can start to move gradually towards more choice as we go along. Set time limits for making decisions. So, if you're worried about it becoming chaotic, then just give them, 2 or 3 minutes to make a decision. And then there's a limit. Interesting point here that Jim Scrivener makes, which I agree with, don't always go with the majority, because sometimes when you have groups making decisions, what happens is that the person who shouts loudest or who is perhaps the most popular will persuade all the other people around them to do the same thing. And maybe that's not the best outcome. So, be willing to sometimes go with a less popular choice that you actually think is better. We've been looking at some ways in which we can help students to develop their decision-making skills by giving them, in a small way to begin with, more autonomy within the class. The second thing I think we can do is to take full advantage of the kinds of classic discussion and decision-making tasks that you will find in any course book. So here is an example. This comes from High Note 4, and it's a classic kind of activity, problem solving. So the students have to look at these posters, which are designed to support a campaign within the school to ban single-use plastic bottles. They have to choose one of the posters and give reasons for their choice. So absolutely classic ELT activity, the kind of thing you often find in exams. And we often find these in course books. So when we have them, we can kind of make the most of them. Now, why do you think that these are so often found in course books? I think that there's a very good reason for this. It's partly, I guess, because they're in exams, but I think a big part of the reason is that they give us such a good opportunity to develop negotiation of meaning. So what I mean by negotiation of meaning is that when we are carrying out some kind of task like this, where we have to agree together and find a solution, we are forced to communicate with others in a way that we might not be in just a general discussion. And when we're kind of struggling to communicate in this way, to get across our point, to make sure that the other person is listening to us and that they have understood, that's, I think, when the learning really happens. So obviously we have to teach students, grammar and vocabulary so that they have some language that they can use. But we also need to give them that opportunity to have a real reason, if you like, to use the language, to struggle a bit to get a result. And in that way, I think the language, firstly, the language becomes more firmly fixed for them. And secondly, of course, they hear language from other students that they then may wish to take on. Now, I've noticed that there seems to be a little bit of a problem again for some people, but some people are saying it's working okay. So this time I think it's probably not my end. Okay, so the other thing to bear in mind with this kind of discussion activity is that there is a natural, what we call a gap, right? So an information gap, perhaps, where one student has a piece of information that the other one doesn't have, or an opinion gap, because the two students have different opinions. So any kind of activity where we have this kind of gap means that the students kind of have to work that little bit harder in order to communicate, and they will be, looking through their language store for language that they can use. And this helps to develop their ability to use the language, and it also gives them a real reason to communicate. And without that sort of real reason to communicate, particularly teenagers may often not be that bothered about actually using the language. But if you give them something that they have to come up with a solution, or they have to make a decision, then that's going to help them, I think. Okay, now sometimes we have these activities, as I said, where there's already like decision making built into the course book. But even when we don't, we can add that in, right? Even if it's not there. So we can turn any kind of discussion task into a decision making task. And the way we can do that is by just changing the question a bit, so it requires them to do something like this, something like listing or ranking or sequencing or categorizing. So let me show you an example. Okay, so this is an example from a lesson on tiny houses. This is from level 4. So towards the end of this lesson, the students are given some discussion questions, as often happens. And if you look at these 5 discussion questions, which one is a decision-making question? Which one requires them to make a decision? Tell me which number you think it is. Okay, yeah. Okay, so number 5 actually requires them to make a decision, because they've got to rate the things in the box from most important to least important. Now, there's nothing wrong with the other questions as discussion questions, but they are probably less likely to get the students engaged in making a decision. So I wouldn't suggest that all of the discussion questions should be decision-making questions like this, not least because it would take up most of your class. However, if you have discussion questions, you should perhaps think about making sure that at least one of them is a decision-making task, and you can turn any discussion question into a decision-making task. So, for example, if we look at number 2, do you agree that living in a very large home might have disadvantages? Instead of asking it that way, we could say, list 5 disadvantages of living in a very large home, and then decide which one is the biggest disadvantage. Okay? So you just need to make the task a little bit more concrete. So think about ranking things, think about, coming up with a certain number of things, think about categorizing. Anything like that is going to turn it into a decision-making task and give your students A, more motivation, and B, more opportunity to develop those decision-making tasks. Right, okay, so we've looked at how giving them more autonomy can help. We've looked at using decision-making tasks in class, so giving them practice of decision-making. So now I'm going to move on to look at some of the characteristics of good decision-makers and how perhaps we can help our students to develop those characteristics if they don't already have them. So starting off, okay, so one characteristic of being a good decision maker is that you are able to envisage possible outcomes. So it's important to understand, right, that no amount of thinking through possible consequences will enable us to be able to really predict the future, right? Sometimes what looked like a good decision turns out not to be because of something that we didn't know. However, being able to kind of think ahead and predict possible consequences is definitely something that makes us a better decision maker, and it's something that teenagers tend to struggle with. Partly, I think, because of what we talked about at the beginning, the way that their brain works, they're not particularly focused on thinking about the future. Secondly, they don't have the experience, perhaps, to envisage what might possibly happen. So, if we can help them to develop this skill, that will obviously help them to make better decisions. So one way that we can do this, I think, is to compensate for their lack of experience by using situations such as, here there's an example. It's a reading which comes from a newspaper article, and the students are asked to consider, what would you do if you found a sports bag at a bus stop and you were the only person there? What would you do if you opened the bag and found $5,000 inside? So this is about a real situation, and the students are asked to imagine hypothetically that they were in that situation. What would they do? What do they think the outcomes would be? So you can do this as we have here with a newspaper story. You could do it with literature. You could even do it with, decisions that people made in history. Somebody's noticed my dog coming in and out, I see. Oh, yes, there he is. Sorry, a bit distracting. So take that hypothetical situation, and that can enable them to develop their ability to predict consequences. Secondly, right, we want our students to think more flexibly. So again, this is something very much to do with the stage of their brain development, that they are likely to sort of think more narrowly, but we want them to start to stretch that and to realize that there are often lots of different ways of looking at a situation. So one way that we can do that, which I like doing very much with teenagers, is using something like this. This is a Pick Your Path book. And this particular one won an award, as you can see at the Eltons. It's published by a company called autonomy. And a Pick Your Path book, essentially, these were very popular when I was a kid, and I think they still are. They work very well for language teaching because the students start to read the story, And then at a certain point, they have to make a decision. So if you look at the story map, this shows you how this works. So they read the first 3 pages, then they have to make a decision. And depending on the decision, they go one way or another way. Then they have to make another decision and they go one way or another way. And then another decision and so on to the end. So this is very good for developing that kind of flexibility because they see that different decisions lead to different outcomes. It's also really good for developing reading because they almost always want to go back and read the story again and see what happens if they make a different decision. And again, probably more than once. So this kind of activity can really help, I think, with developing flexibility. The third key quality, I think, in making a good decision is the ability to get information from elsewhere, and particularly, for teenagers who have limited life experience. So listening to what others have to say, something that teenagers don't always respond to very well, but learning that, they don't have to do what others say necessarily, but that they can find out more, and researching. So getting as much information as possible before making a decision. So here's an example of a lesson from High Note. This is level 2. It's a life skills lesson on how to choose a future career. So in this lesson, the students are kind of taken through a process. And one of the things that they do is to make suggestions to their partners about possible careers that they think would suit them. And then in the last task, in exercise 9, they go away and research on the internet about the career that their partner suggested for them. So this kind of follows both of those points. They're listening to somebody else's suggestion, not necessarily following it, but listening to it and exploring it. And they're also doing some research. And then the fourth and final quality, which is important in making good decisions, is being able to understand your own values and priorities. Now, this is something that teenagers, it's not that long since they were children. They're really only just starting to understand themselves. And this is something that they're usually very interested in. That's why there are all those sort of personality quizzes and things on BuzzFeed. They want to understand themselves better. And so we can use that natural interest, but show them how understanding yourself can help you to make a better decision. So here's an example, again, a life skills lesson. This is from level 4. And this lesson is about how to make the most of volunteering. Or in other words, how to choose the best volunteering opportunity for you. So not just volunteering is good, but, how do you choose the best one for you? And if you look at the life skills box, here we're getting them to think about, well, what causes are important to me? What do I care about? What skills do I have that I could offer? What experience do I have? What kind of person am I? Am I better at working alone or in a team? What skills would I like to learn? So we're getting them to explore themselves as a way of then making a good decision. Okay, so we've looked then at how we can kind of embed decision making into the classroom in terms of giving more autonomy. We've looked at how we can use decision making activities that are already in the materials we use and how we can add them in when they're not there. We've looked at how we can develop some of the skills that students need to make decisions. And now finally, we're going to look at the process of decision making and how we can help students go through this process. So first of all then, when people have to make a decision, let's say which university they're going to, what do you think is the first thing that most people do? Just put it in the chat box. So what do you think is the first thing that most people do when they have to make a decision? I bet I can guess what you're going to say. Or maybe not. You might surprise me. Yes, okay, the first thing, all right, a list of pros and cons, right? That's what I was looking for. All right, panic, yes, that might be true. Pros and cons, or pluses and minuses. So that's what most people do when they need to make a decision. And there's nothing wrong with that exactly, but it isn't the whole picture by any means in terms of making a decision, because it's not just about pros and cons, because some of the pros or some of the cons might be much more important than some of the others. There's also this idea that a pros and cons, that there's just one thing that you have to decide about, whereas often there are lots of things. Now we're coming up with some other ideas here, which is great, all right? So thinking about their personality, doing some research. So these are the kinds of things we've been talking about. And definitely that's the kind of thing that we need to help students to do. So here is like a summary, if you like, of maybe a better decision-making process, which includes the things that you're mentioning in the chat box. So first of all, what is the decision that you have to make? Obviously. Then what are the options that you have? So not just pros and cons, not just something binary, but what are all the options that you have? You know, maybe it's not just which university, maybe it's also whether you go to university at all, or what else you could do. What do you think the consequences of these options might be? So again, we talked about how important it is to really think through the consequences and think beyond this immediate decision. What values do you need to consider? You know, so what's important to you? So, for example, if you're thinking about a future career, if it's very important to you that you have a job that helps people, then you need to consider that. Is there anything else you need to learn about it? So, you know, are you going to research it? Who could you talk to about it? Do you need to ask for help? Who could help you? Maybe somebody who's already doing that job, for example. Then you can make a decision. And then, and this is important, you should encourage them to reflect back on the decision that they made and consider whether it was the right decision. And if it wasn't, that doesn't necessarily mean that they made a bad decision. They just possibly didn't have all the information, but they can perhaps learn from that when they make the next decision. Okay, so I think this kind of process, somebody mentioned in the comments that it's a kind of coaching approach. Yes, absolutely, because that's one of the things that I do. But there are some other things that they also need to think about, particularly when they're thinking about consequences of the options. And that is their cognitive bias. So cognitive bias really is just a way of thinking that can influence what we decide. And we all have these cognitive biases, adults, you know, as well as teenagers. They're natural human things, but being aware of them can often help us to overcome them. So I'm just going to talk about 3 of them that I think are particularly relevant here. Okay, so the first one is something referred to as present bias. Now, this is something that everybody has to some degree or another. So present bias is the natural human tendency to value our present experience over the future. So, for example, let's talk about spending money. All right, most people tend to value what they can buy with money now over something that they may be saving for in the future. Some people have learned to overcome that present bias better than others. Right? Teenagers generally have a lot of present bias because they don't think about the future much at all. So being aware of that can help them to overcome that present bias and realize that something that is a bit uncomfortable now, like having to do a lot of work, will be worth it in the future because it will enable them to get what they want in the future. The second bias that I think we need to consider is negative bias. So this is, again, a very natural human tendency to focus on the negative. I mean, this is why, if you've ever wondered why newspapers are newspapers, online news is full of negative stories. This is because as humans, we are wired to notice and to be interested in negative stories more than positive ones. And this is quite a natural thing because it helps biologically to keep us safe. You know, our ancestors, the ones who listened to the story about the saber-toothed tiger attacking the next village, are more likely to have survived than those who didn't. So this is very natural, but it can also get in the way of making a good decision, because that natural sort of negative bias may tell you, oh, there's no point in applying to that university because, you know, they'll never give me a place. So you need to question that negative bias and not just go along with it. And thirdly, there's something called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is that, again, natural tendency that we have to only notice information which confirms what we already believe. You know, so if we already believe that, let's say, a particular university isn't a very good place to go, then we will tend to only notice the bits of information that confirm that and totally ignore any information which tells us the opposite. So again, being aware of that can help us to actually seek out, let's say, positive information about that university so that we get a more balanced view before we make a decision. Okay, so these are all of the things that I think we can teach our students about the process of making a decision. Now, this will obviously help them in terms of making bigger decisions, like their careers, like going to university. And then when they get into careers, it will also help them because obviously employers want people who can make good decisions. You know, in most jobs, you have to make decisions all the time. You know, who are you going to employ? Which items are you going to sell? You know, it's absolutely key, I think. It will also help them, I think, with much smaller decisions that are, however, very important. So right at the beginning, lots of you were talking about how students can be demotivated or lazy, or, you know, and that is because ultimately they're not making a decision which will ultimately help them. So they're not taking responsibility for it themselves. So, you know, they're saying, oh, I'll do it later, or even giving you as the teacher the responsibility. No, it isn't fair, she's given me so much homework, not understanding that actually that homework is there to help them. So teaching our students these skills has a very wide application in their lives, in their future lives, and in their careers. All right, so finally, I'm going to look at one activity that you can do in class, which will help students, I think, to understand why the decision-making process is so important. So, as I said at the beginning, teenagers have a tendency to make decisions with their guts, if you like, so more emotional, reactive decisions. So we talk about, in English, we talk about making a decision with your head or with your gut. So with your gut, it's that emotional reaction. Now, ideally, what we really want, I think, to make a good decision is a combination of both. You know, so sometimes our instincts can be very helpful, but what we want is to combine that with everything else that we've talked about. So this activity helps to show students just why that's so important. So let's take an example of another decision-making activity. This is from High Note 3, and this is a classic decision-making activity. So looking at exercise 6, the students are put into groups and they have to choose a natural disaster, the lessons about natural disasters, and agree on 10 items to put in a survival pack. So the way you can do this, the heads and guts way, is initially you say to the students individually, you just give them a very short amount of time, like 2 or 3 minutes, and you say, right, you've got 2 or 3 minutes to write down 10 items to put in your survival pack. Right, so you set a timer, they write down the 10 items and they totally go with their gut instincts, because that's all they've got time to do. Right, and then you get the students to think about how else they could make this decision. Right? So, for example, you've mentioned some of these things in the chat box before. But tell me again, what else could they do to make a good decision? So, for example, they could do some research online, couldn't they, into what you would want in a survival pack if you were trying to survive an earthquake. Okay, what else could they do to get a better decision? Let me see how much you've taken in from the webinar. Any other ideas? Yeah, so ask for advice, so they could ask each other. Right. They could potentially ask you if you know more about this than another. Right. Yeah, they could watch a YouTube video. Right. Ask for help. Right. Think through the consequences. So they might think, right, okay, if the building collapsed and I was under this building, you know, what would I really need? What would I need in day one? What would I need in day two? Yeah, look for videos of survivors talking about their experiences or their own experiences, indeed. Right. So, okay, I won't go through everything, but you can see how you could get them to think about all the different ways they could make a decision. Right. What would I need this item for, says Carol. Exactly. Right. And then you get them to work together using all of these ideas and resources and come up with another list of 10 items. And then you ask them to compare the two lists. So the list that they wrote very quickly in 2 minutes and the final list after all the thinking and discussion and trying to project ahead and making sure that they're not using confirmation bias and so on, and see which one is better. And I guarantee that the second list is going to be better. Right? And they will be able to see this, and therefore that will help them to understand the benefit, if you like, of a decision-making process, which they can then apply to other things in their life, and you can refer back to it and so on. Right. Okay, so in this webinar then, so we've looked at some different ways to help students develop their decision-making skills, and we've also looked at kind of just why this is so important for students. It's important in terms of them making quite small decisions about, am I going to do my homework or not? Making bigger decisions like what subjects they're going to study, what their career might be, what university they're going to. And then, of course, it is a career skill, because throughout their career, just as with you, making all those decisions, they will also have to make decisions. And this is very much something that employers are looking for. So I've finished there. Do you have any questions? I'm just seeing here, Malgorzata says, what if the students have ideas but don't know how to put it in English? Well, I think this is, this is where we can help them, really. I mean, especially if you speak their first language, you can help them to put it into English. I think that's absolutely fine. And then get them to use that the next time that they're discussing it. Any other questions about decision making? Questions or comments? Will there be a webinar on prioritising? We've had a webinar on prioritising. That was last week, but you can now watch it on YouTube. Okay, so as you can see, I'll bring this one up. Any ideas about how to help decision making with little ones? Well, I think that might be another whole webinar, really, and I'm not really a primary expert, but it's a good thing to think about. Right. Okay, so these are the webinars that we've already had, and the recordings are now available, and I will show you where you can go to get more information in a moment. Next week, there's going to be a webinar on leadership skills. I'm going to be running that webinar. And then, not the following week, but the week after, on the 17th of March, we'll be looking at teamwork skills. Okay, so let me also tell you about everything else that is available for you in terms of preparing your students for the world of work. So we have these webinars. We also have training videos for teachers and students. And there will also be blog posts. We're going to prepare some classroom resources and a guide to the whole area. So you can see the link here, so english.com/career-skills. So that's where you can find all of this as we put it together. So thank you very much. And I'm sorry about some of the technical issues that some of you had and all of you had when I disappeared. But I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Very nice to see so many people here. Greetings to my son. Yes, I hope he enjoyed school today as well. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you next week. I might see some of you in Poland, which is what I'm doing the week in between, the week of the 10th. So thanks very much. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to close the webinar now and yes, go and see if my son had a good day at school. Have a nice evening and thank you, and hopefully see you next week.